Rhode Island isn't the place you'd expect a nuclear disaster. But in 1964, deep in the woods of Charleston, a single mistake unleashed something silent, deadly, and unstoppable. A flash of blue light, a working-class father of 9, and one of the most horrific radiation deaths in U.S. history. This is the Wood River Junction Criticality accident, the story they tried to bury. Welcome back to Weirder After Dark, the podcast we get into all things New England weird. My name is Sean, and I'm here with my two co-hosts.
I am Chris.
And I'm Kathy.
And today we have an episode that is going to be absolutely nuclear. Are you all ready for this?
I'm ready.
I'm ready.
Well, I want to start off here since I'm going to be leading the episode with a quick question for you two. And I'm curious, from everything that you know and have heard about the 1950s and 60s, what are some of the major technological breakthroughs that you think about?
I think about the fact that that's when the colored TV came out, right? Pretty sure.
Yeah. I think at least was becoming really popular then and was getting distributed and viable in people's households.
Didn't they put the first satellite in outer space in the
Yeah, they
50s?
did. They did.
Is that when they were trying to go to the moon?
Yeah, absolutely was. And I think right there was probably what most people would point to when they start thinking about technological advancements during that period. It's the space race, right? It was an era of firsts. They had the first human orbit the Earth in Yuri Gagarin, the first woman in space, Valentina Tereshkova, the first successful Mars flyby by a satellite, which is super cool. And of course, you can't forget the Apollo missions, the first steps and footsteps on the moon, all were happening inside, this particular period of time. They captivated the world, symbolized an era of possibility moving forward. If you go to the moon, what couldn't be done? Well, while everyone was looking up, there were actually other major technological advancements happening during this period. And one of them promised to change the way that we lived, work, and explored space itself. Nuclear energy. In the late 1950s, the U.S. wasn't just hopeful about nuclear energy, it was all in. Nuclear energy was supposed to be the future, a clean, limitless power source that would fuel homes and industry. Scientists and policymakers envisioned a world where nuclear energy would be so abundant that it would be too cheap to meter.
The idea was to have free energy.
Yeah, they thought that this was going to be so viable.
So it didn't turn out that way.
It so did not, right? And that's actually what I want to transition into. What happened to this wave of optimism, right? It didn't last. Environmentalists and anti-nuclear activists had huge concerns about radiation exposure, the handling of nuclear waste, the impacts on the environment, and possibilities of terrible accidents. And looking back, they had every single right to voice these concerns because after proving nuclear power viability and beginning to roll it out in scale, the U.S. experienced multiple nuclear criticality accidents. 3 partial reactor meltdowns, several radiation leaks at weapons facilities.
How come I've never heard of these?
I know nothing about any of these.
Well, that's okay. We got to talk a little bit about these to set the stage for today's story. In fact, in 1979, all of these criticality events, these partial reactor meltdowns, these weapon leaks, it all kind of came to head with the first major civilian nuclear power plant accident in U.S. history, 3 Mile Island. Now, 3 Mile Island was a partial meltdown of a nuclear reactor in Pennsylvania. And while no one died, radiation was released into the environment, triggering nationwide panic and shattering public trust about nuclear energy as a whole. After the fact, government reports claim that radiation exposure from 3 Mile Island was minimal, about the same as a routine chest x-ray is what pretty much hit the people around it, and that there was no widespread damage to plants, animals, or water supplies. But the cleanup ended up taking 14 years and cost over $1 billion. Yet, the real damage? It wasn't the cost. It wasn't the environmental impact. It was the complete erosion of America's faith in nuclear power. That disaster struck enough fear into U.S. citizens that it pretty much put a complete halt onto nuclear production facilities inside the United States. While 3 Mile Island dominated the headlines in the United States, there was another nuclear accident, one that happened right here in New England, an event that didn't involve a meltdown, didn't even happen at a nuclear power plant, but still led to one of the highest radiation exposures ever recorded in human history. Today, I want to tell you the story of Wood River Junction, Rhode Island's nuclear accident, the story of New England's only nuclear fatality. Our story starts and takes place in Charleston, Rhode Island in April 1964. For the past year, excitement radiated through the small town of roughly 2,000 people. A new business was about to open its doors, promising opportunity and progress. The business was United Nuclear Corporation.
Radiated.
Eh.
Well played.
It was supposed to be a game changer, a multi-million-dollar facility bringing good-paying, stable jobs, putting Rhode Island on the map in the nuclear industry. Now, the facility that United Nuclear was opening wasn't a nuclear power station. This place had a different mission, processing and recycling nuclear waste. The facility was set up to recover scrap production materials from nuclear power plants, spent fuel rods, scrap uranium, and all the leftover junk from making energy. When those materials arrived, they went through a harsh chemical process where nitric acid-based solutions cleaned them, stripping away the enriched uranium-235 and separating it from the rest of the waste. The Wood River Junction facility was a complex maze of tanks, processing tubes, evaporation beds, and a web of pipes.
So this is like recycling for nuclear physicists?
Basically.
All right.
Yeah, that's really what's happening at the end of the day.
I'm sorry. So they can figure out how to recycle nuclear waste, but yet we still struggle with recycling plastic bottles.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
But it still creates nuclear waste. So it's not like a complete recycling. When everything functioned correctly, the uranium recovery process ran like an assembly line. Scrap materials were dissolved in a strong acid solution and processed through multiple stages, where the uranium-235 was gradually extracted. Each step pulled out more of the valuable uranium, while waste products were diverted and then stored. At the end of the process, the recovered uranium was ready to be sent off to be converted back into nuclear fuel. What remained behind was a radioactive, acidic waste solution that went by the name of pickle liquor. This contaminated liquid still contained varying levels of uranium. This was then recycled through the Wood River Junction's facility systems multiple times in an attempt to extract every last uranium-235 particle. But complete extraction was impossible. Once the process had reached its limits, the remaining low levels of uranium-laced waste was sealed and stored. Now, it's important to note that even though this wasn't a nuclear power plant, the facility was still working with highly enriched uranium. What could go wrong? So let's just break down like how dangerous this could be. What's worst case scenario could potentially look like, right? What were the safety precautions that had to come into play? I'm going to give us a bit of an analogy here, all right? Think of uranium-235 atoms. That's what they're pulling out of all this waste. Think of it like a kernel of popcorn in a microwave, okay? Each kernel, the uranium atom, pops when it's hit with heat, all right? I want you to think of that as a neutron, okay? Heat, neutron, kernel, uranium-235. When the kernel, uranium atom, pops, that pop releases more heat or neutrons. This heat from one kernel, the neutrons, then hit other kernels of uranium atoms and cause them to pop. If there aren't a lot of kernels or uranium-235 in one area, a chain reaction, it can't occur, right? If one pops and there's nothing else there for the heat or the neutrons to hit, nothing else will pop. But on the flip side, if you accidentally pack too many kernels or uranium atoms close together, you can get hit with what's called a critical mass. That means you have too many kernels in one area. All of a sudden, if it gets hit with a neutron, one pops and explodes, creates more neutrons. They hit the other kernels, uranium. They pop and explode. And that's what creates the chain reaction of a nuclear event.
I'm envisioning the Jiffy Pop that used to be back in the day when they would put it on the stove with the middle thing and it go pop, 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 and it would just get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger.
You have hit critical mass. It's an uncontrollable chain reaction is basically what occurs when these atoms hit critical mass. I also want to put a disclaimer. I am not a physicist, okay? So this was a lot of Google searching. So if there is a physicist listening to this, I'm so sorry if I got any of this wrong.
I truly appreciate the popcorn analogy because that was the only way I was going to get that.
I needed it too.
Yes.
Why do you think it was in the
That's
story? Yeah. An uncontrollable chain reaction. This is what's known as a criticality event. When it happens, a deadly burst of radiation is unleashed, accompanied by a blinding blue flash of light, and an intense heat surge can occur inside of these moments. To prevent a criticality event from occurring, you have to be very careful and control how much uranium is in any one place at one time. So, to keep everything safe at the Rhode Island facility, they use geometrically shaped containers. What these are is they're just really long, thin cylinders, about 5 inches in diameter, but they're 4 feet long. These were designed to prevent uranium from pooling and accumulating inside of one spot, therefore reducing the risk that a critical mass could ultimately occur. So basically, they had these special containers that prevented too much uranium from being in one spot at one time.
So something about the design of the container keeps it from clumping up.
It only allows like certain amount to be in a particular area at one time. Whereas on the flip side, if instead of using these really thin, long containers and holding them that way, if they put it in, let's say, a bowl, all the uranium could fall to the bottom of the bowl, could create critical mass. Okay. But here's where things got complicated. Since the plant was a reprocessing facility, incoming waste had a lot of uranium-235 in it. As the material was processed, it would ultimately have less and less uranium, meaning some containers held highly enriched uranium, while others had much lower concentrations of uranium. To keep track of what was inside each container, they were labeled to indicate the level of enrichment. So far, that makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Sounds like a good process, right? What could possibly go wrong? Well, the stickers they would use to label these containers, they don't stick really well to the containers. So what they did to try to go ahead and help that is they'd actually take rubber bands and put rubber bands over the stickers to help keep them in place.
That was the only solution?
This is what we got in 1964.
I mean, this is the state-of-the-art facility that's got all these different safety, and we've got stickers and rubber bands.
Yeah, baby, we got rubber bands.
To track nuclear
yes.
material.
Nothing can go wrong here, right? I want us to remember this detail because you can imagine it might play an important factor down the road in our story.
I hope that guy got fired.
Yeah. Oh, Chris. That's cute. Okay. Now that we understand what's happening inside the facility, let's transition to our story. So I want to take us back to the week of July 19th through 25th, 1964, just 4 months after the Rhode Island facility opened. We're going to officially meet our main character, production operator, Robert Peabody. Robert Peabody was a resident of Charleston, living just 5-minute drive from the United Nuclear Corp facility. He was 37 years old. He was married to a woman named Anna, and he had 9 children. And I just want to pause again on the 9 children.
Why?
Yes. Why? And why does every episode that we do, these motherfuckers have 9 children? You know what? This is creating a hypothesis for me that if you have more than, 4 children, you're asking for weird shit to happen to you.
I mean, it makes sense back in like the 18, 16, 1700s, you know?
Yeah.
There was a reason they just kept having, people kept dying. But.
Yeah. During the day, Robert worked as an auto mechanic, so when he found out that the United Nuclear Corporation was offering night shifts, he jumped at the opportunity. After all, he had 9 kids to support, and for United Nuclear, it was a no-brainer. Robert had previous experience in the nuclear industry. He previously worked at the Electric Boat Shipyard's nuclear propulsion division, so it was kind of a match made in heaven, right?
Well, wait a minute. We have a nuclear scientist and he's working as a mechanic?
Yeah, well, he's not quite a nuclear scientist, unfortunately. So he did work inside these facilities, but he was more of doing some manual tasks inside these facilities is really what he's focused on.
So he's familiar with the procedures anyway, but he's not a physicist.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
Exactly. So up until this week in July 1964, everything at the facility had been running relatively smooth. But this week already hadn't been like the others. On Wednesday, July 22nd, a radiation alarm had sounded. This triggered a huge panic across the entire crew inside the building. But luckily, only one alarm went off. If there was a real radiation event, all the alarms in the building would have went off. After researching and finding out, what happened is someone was cleaning an area and they accidentally sprayed an alarm with water. And that's what caused the alarm to go off and caused them to freak out. So they got super lucky that, hey, it was a false alarm. Nothing really happened there. But that's how their week kind of started, was with this false alarm.
This place sounds like they're really running procedures, safety. It's on point.
Just wait, Kathy. It gets better. Throughout the week after the alarm, something even stranger started happening. A black goo-like substance began to collect all over the processing facility. Even more unsettling, nobody knew what it was or why it was forming. By Thursday, July 23rd, the black goo had become so bad, the facility's managers decided that they had to shut the equipment down, disassemble everything, and clean it, and finally deal with this mystery substance.
How long did it take for them to shut the plant down?
About a day and a half. Before they're like, this is getting worse, not better.
Don't you think you should be like, there's mysterious black goo? Immediately shut this plant down.
There wasn't a policy and procedure book on what to do with it. There were no step-by-step instructions on how to remove mysterious black goo in their handbooks. So the workers had to come up with their own plan and their own process. So the first step, in order to assemble everything, they had to empty all of the large tanks and evaporation beds that were filled with enriched uranium. Uranium that was in various stages of processing, some of which at levels they had never stored in geometrically safe containers before. But after working it all out, they did have physicists there or the smart people in the room. They determined that these geometrically safe containers, they could hold all this uranium and everything would be safe and there was no real threat of a criticality event. And in fact, they were right. So the workers grabbed the geometrically shaped containers, drained the uranium into them, measured the amount, marked the contents on the containers on the label, secured the labels with rubber bands, and then stored them. It was an incredibly manual process. Once that was done, they could finally start disassembling and cleaning the facility. Making matters even more difficult, every single item used in cleaning and the disassembly process, I want you to think towels, rags, even the workers' protective clothing would become slightly radioactive and had to be carefully handled and cleaned or disposed of because they're touching stuff that had, uranium inside of it. New routines and safety procedures were being invented on the fly, leaving workers scrambling to keep up. The long days stretched even longer, and the pressure to maintain efficiency in a hazardous environment only grew. And I think we can all agree that mistakes were probably inevitable. Then came the rumors. Some claimed that there were confusions over whether the bottles of uranium solution had been correctly labeled with their precise concentration. Others even whispered about a leaking bottle that was on the main floor and its contents were slowly pooling out into the middle of the floor. So things are getting not only messy, but a little confusing on what exactly was happening. But the work continued. When Robert Peabody arrived for his night shift on Friday, July 24th, he was assigned the routine but incredibly grueling task of starting to clean the facility's trichloroethane. Now, what does that mean, you're wondering? Well, during normal operations of the plant, workers used trichloroethane, a dry cleaning solvent, to wash uranium. However, once the trichloroethane, the dry cleaning solvent, had been used, it became contaminated itself with uranium-235s. So you now have the very solution you're using to help in the process is contaminated and needs to be cleaned. Disposing of trichloroethane wasn't an economical option. So every week, the used trichloroethane was collected and moved into a geometrically safe container. To extract the uranium from the cleaning solution, workers would add sodium carbonate solution and begin a manual process to clean the cleaning fluid. So what was this process? Well, it was shaking a container by hand.
Okay.
That's right. Each container, these geometrically shaped containers, weighed 35 pounds with the liquid into it, and the workers were required to take this 35-pound container and just continuously shake it for 20 minutes. After the shaking, the separation of the uranium-235 would begin. The trichloroethane settled in the middle of the container. The uranium combined with the sodium carbonate and sank to the bottom of the container, and the waste that was left over would float to the top. The recovered uranium went back into processing, and the trichloroethane was reused to clean more uranium moving forward. And this was a regular process at the facility that had to happen over and over again. Now, I want you to imagine shaking a 35-pound container for 20 minutes.
I can say that I work for a chemical company, and I'm pretty sure that part of their procedure for dealing with hazardous materials is not to just give it to a person in a bottle and say, here, stand here and shake this. Does not sound safe.
Seems like it should be an automated process, not a...
Yeah.
Does not seem okay.
I also just imagine, have you ever lifted up a 35-pound weight?
Yeah, no, that would be
and held it out in front of you for 20 minutes?
No.
That's exhausting. I can only imagine how exhausting that must be. And then you have to do it over and over, hour after hour, day after day. This is a routine part of their process.
But your delts look fantastic.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean,
but those arms jacked. It was grueling. It was miserable. So the men at the facility found a shortcut. On the third floor of the plant, there was a large industrial mixer with a massive stainless steel bowl, perfect for taking the work off their hands. Instead of manually shaking 35-pound container for 20 minutes, the workers started pouring the contaminated trichloroethane directly into the mixer. Then they would add the sodium carbonate, and then they'd turn the machine on and just let the mixer do the work.
Yeah.
I can see how they're like, this is a good idea. I feel like it's not, though.
Where's their supervisor? Like, what's going on here? Are these people all left unattended? Like,
yeah, I'm glad you asked. The supervisor on duty, when the shortcut was first devised, didn't see a problem with it.
Oh.
He did the math with the team, and because the trichloroethane had such low levels of uranium-235 at that point, they felt that there was little to no chance of anything bad actually happening.
All right.
So they were just like, hey, if it's saving you time and making the job easier, I don't see the risk. Go for it.
They did the math.
Was the mathing?
The math actually did math. It did math. It did math out. So you can imagine once you do this shortcut once and nothing blows up, this is now part of your daily routine, right? You're no longer shaking these for 20 minutes in your hand. So for weeks, the workers poured uranium-contaminated trichloroethane into the industrial mixer, added the sodium carbonate, and let the machine do the work. And there were no incidences and no one questioned it until one supervisor found out. It's said that when this supervisor discovered what was happening, he absolutely lost his shit. Furious, he demanded it stopped immediately. But all of the other men pushed back, said, no, bro, it's cool. Nothing's happened. We've been doing it for weeks. And he was like, cool.
It's just nuclear physics. Yeah. It'll probably be fine.
The math. So eventually he gave in and the mixer process kept running. This unofficial routine is exactly what Robert Peabody set out to do on Friday, July 24th, when he was instructed to start washing the facility's trichloroethane. So Peabody walked over to go pick up one of the geometrically shaped containers, put it in a specially designed transportation cart, and started heading towards the third floor to use the mixing bowl. But what Peabody didn't know was that the container he grabbed wasn't filled with low-level radioactive trichloroethane. It was a container containing extremely high levels of enriched uranium-235. It was one of the containers that had been filled earlier the day before during the chaos of the plant disassembly for the cleaning. Whether it wasn't marked correctly or if it wasn't labeled at all, I think we can all say that in the chaos of what sounds like unfolded, we could easily see that if things are held on by rubber bands, maybe a sheet fell off one and they didn't know which one it fell off of and they just threw it right back on one and maybe that's what happened.
In that chaos, everyone's running around and they're just passing jars and they're like, here, this is this. And then the person that gets it to do the label misheard.
Yeah, something
maybe.
It obviously was a chaotic situation.
I can see something like that getting missed in the middle of all that chaos and the rumors and the fear.
There was no policy and procedure for what they were doing. We can see all the gaps in different ways something could have gone wrong. And hell, if that's not bad enough, the exact procedure that Robert Peabody is on his way to go do is a made-up procedure of basically throwing into a cake mixer. Throwing uranium into a cake mixer.
That has been being done over the course of several weeks at this point.
Exactly, right? So this is just business as usual. Unfortunately, all of this was unknown to Peabody at the time that he had the wrong container. So he just took the container up to the third floor, intending to use the mixing bowl. He poured in the sodium carbonate, turned on the mixer, and then emptied the contents of the geometrically safe container into the steel bowl. I'm going to read directly from an article called Nuclear Fatality at Wood River Junction that was published in Yankee Magazine by Dennis E. Powell to unpack the actual steps of what happened. "Oh my God," shouted Peabody, but his words were drowned out by the shriek of sirens going off throughout the building. Not just one alarm this time, all of them. A flash of blue light emanated from a mixing vat, which now erupted in hot, glowing liquid that splashed as high as the 12-foot ceilings. Peabody was knocked backwards. He knew instantly what had happened. Somehow, the mixture in the vat had achieved criticality. Instead of a mixing machine processing solvent, he had an uncontrolled nuclear reactor. He let go of the bottle, which slid upside down and into the container. He ran from the room. He was already a dead man, and he knew it. What had happened was this. The uranium mixture had been in its safe geometry bottle. So though there was enough of the fissionable material to create a nuclear reaction, it was spread out over sufficient distance to keep the reaction from taking place. But when it was poured into the vat, 18 inches in diameter, it was physically concentrated. A reaction began instantly. Peabody was bombarded with an enormous number of neutrons as well as gamma rays. He dashed down the stairs, yanked open the door at the bottom of the 3-story tower, and ran toward the facility's emergency shack, 450 feet away. While he was running, he tore the clothes that he was wearing off his body. He had been splashed with a uranium mixture, and if there was even a slight chance of his survival, it required limiting further exposure. The others, all who had been working on the first floor, were running there too. This did not sound like another false alarm that had happened earlier this week. If there was any doubt in their minds, it was dispelled by the sight of Peabody, naked and shouting, running for the shack.
Just so I understand, so basically he's pouring the uranium into the cylinder, the big giant mixer, and it literally kind of created a giant Jiffy Pop.
Basically, it's like Jiffy Pop. Yeah, basically like a mini explosion occurred inside the pot.
It splattered back onto him, contaminating all the area around.
You got it. It created a chain reaction that created a burst of radiation and gamma rays that pretty much directly hit him.
Yeah.
And gamma rays don't stop because there's a wall in the way.
Inside the shack, Peabody was dying by the second. Blood poured from his nose, his ears, his mouth, and even his rectum. He coughed, then gagged, then vomited violently, his entire body convulsing with the effort. One of his hands, the one that had taken the full force of the radiation, was turning an unnatural shade of red. His muscles seized with unbearable cramps, locking his limbs in place, making it nearly impossible for him to hold himself up. His coworkers say he rose to his feet more than once, staggering forward in eerie silence, only to collapse again, weaker each time. Frantic, there was nothing anyone could do but cover his trembling naked body with a blanket. At 7 p.m., an ambulance screamed into the yard and loaded Peabody inside. But when they arrived at Westerly Hospital, they were turned away. The staff knew there was nothing they could do at this small hospital. But honestly, no medicine, no machine, no intervention could stop what had already begun. So the ambulance was rerouted to Rhode Island Hospital. By the time they arrived, it was 7:25. Peabody was still heaving, his body racked with uncontrollable spasms, his insides boiling. But Rhode Island Hospital is no different. No hospital was. There was no cure, and to this day, there is no cure for acute radiation poisoning. Doctors had no treatment to offer Peabody. All they could do was sit and wait. And while they sat and waited and attempted to treat the symptoms as they came, they rushed Peabody to an old X-ray room for isolation. In the official reports that I read, his blood pressure had an initial reading of 160/180. His pulse pounded at 100 beats per minute as he laid perfectly flat and still in a bed. When his wife and son arrived, they were stopped at the door. They were warned that Peabody himself was radioactive, so they were only allowed to stand at the foot of the bed, watching helplessly as the man they loved died before their eyes. His skin blistered as his body, moment by moment, was shutting down, and there was nothing at all that could be done. Peabody remained conscious as his body deteriorated.
Yeah, radiation is literally killing your cells from the inside out.
At that point, can't they just dose him, so he's not in pain? I don't know.
Yeah, well, let's go a little further. You'll get a couple of answers here, I think. Peabody's hand, where the radiation had struck hardest, continued to swell at an alarming rate. The flesh stretched tight, ballooning so much that the doctors had no choice but to saw off his wedding ring, even against Peabody's wishes. He didn't want it to come off, but they had to. By Sunday afternoon, the fight was over and Peabody slipped into a coma. By Sunday night, just 49 hours after his exposure, Peabody was dead. His internal organs had completely shut down.
I feel really bad laughing in the beginning of the episode. Way to make me feel like an asshole, Sean.
Yeah. Thanks. Stories are like roller coasters, I guess. When specialists analyzed Peabody's wedding ring, the results were staggering. Peabody had been blasted with somewhere between 700 and 1,000 rems of radiation, the equivalent of standing in front of 70 to 100,000 chest x-rays at one time. I want to give us some context because I don't know what rems are and what damage does. So I did a little homework for us. 5 rems of radiation is the maximum yearly dose allowed for U.S. radiation workers. 100 rems causes mild radiation sickness, nausea, vomiting, fatigue. 300 rems has a 50% mortality rate without treatment, and treatment would be like a bone marrow transplant is like the best they can try to do for you. 450 rems, the equivalent of 45,000 chest x-rays, 50% of people die within 30 days. 700 rems, the lowest possible amount that he got hit with, is completely fatal, causes organ failure, internal bleeding, and destruction of an individual's bone marrow. 1,000 rems or more, survival is completely impossible, and side effects can be absolutely horrifying. I read some incidences where people's skin literally was peeling off their bodies. Oof. Like, just absolutely crazy. To put it in a little more perspective, at the Chernobyl event, the firefighters who went into the building to try to prevent the meltdown from happening and put some of the fires out, some received 600 to 1,600 rems, and they all died within weeks of their exposure. Peabody's exposure ranks as the highest recorded civilian radiation accident in U.S. history, the most severe incident outside of military or national labs. His death was preventable, his suffering unimaginable, and yet sadly it happened right here in New England. Let's talk about the aftermath. Ultimately, a lawsuit was filed against United Nuclear Corporation. Anna, Robert Peabody's wife, settled with the company for $22,000.
What?
Yeah, which is roughly about $220K in today's money. So not a lot for a family of 9 with no father now to help take care of it.
Yeah.
That's awful.
Yeah, especially after clear procedural failures that obviously happened inside the facility. But the damage didn't actually stop with Peabody. Because his body was literally radioactive, everyone who came near him in those final hours was also exposed to radiation themselves. His coworkers at the United Nuclear Facility, the healthcare professionals who fought to save him, even his own family, his wife and son who stood at the edge of the bed, were also exposed to levels of radiation. And then what happened to Robert Peabody's body? I found conflicting reports on this. Some sources claim he was laid to rest in a lead-lined coffin, his family barred from seeing him due to the contamination risks. Others suggest something even more disturbing might have happened, that there was no body to bury at all and it was kept by the government to study. In the 1994 article in Yankee magazine, Anna Peabody recalled being given an urn and told that the ashes inside were her husband's remains, but she personally never believed that. She noted one glaring inconsistency. The ashes that she received had zero trace of radioactivity.
That was going to literally, I'm like, so wouldn't the ashes be radioactive? Wouldn't that be dangerous to just give somebody a thing of ashes that could potentially cause harm if it got exposed to other people?
That's what the article would lead you to believe. I was curious, so I did a little researching and digging into this myself because I was like, oh man, like ashes could be radioactive? That's crazy. So I did fact check it. It seems like this is lore. If the body was cremated, the process of burning the body itself would have vaporized the radioactive contaminants. So from the research I found, I don't think there's any good argument to be like, the ashes should have been radioactive.
Okay.
How was Peabody's body treated after the fact? Was it disposed? Was it taken by the government for study? Was it really his ashes in the urn? I don't know. I don't know if we'll ever truly know at the end of the day what happened to it. But I thought that was a weird little mystery that I found at the end of the story. What we do know is what happened to the people that he touched, the ones who stood by him and the ones who tried to help. For Peabody's coworkers at the United Nuclear Corporation, Peabody was alone during the Criticality accident. His coworkers, though, weren't entirely safe. They all suffered low to moderate radiation exposure, but none developed acute radiation sickness. As far as long-term effects, that's where the trail kind of went cold on me. There's no clear records that I can find of any lingering illnesses and no definitive proof of what exposure might have done to them in the years that followed. Whether they live unaffected or suffered in silence, I couldn't find an answer one way or another for the individuals inside the building with him. As for the ambulance and the hospital staff, the ambulance crew that rushed Peabody to the hospital absorbed radiation, but not enough to cause any immediate harm. Hospital staff, even after taking precautions, were also exposed to low levels of radiation, but also nothing crazy measurable and didn't really have any effects. But there was one really chilling detail I found. The ambulance itself, the very vehicle that carried Peabody's body in his final hours, was deemed too radioactive to be used again, and it was burned, completely torched by fire, and then buried under the ground like nuclear waste.
Wow.
Yeah.
The ambulance drivers didn't have to be burned, but the ambulance did.
Yeah.
That's a little scary.
Yeah. What they must have been feeling knowing that, right? Like,
yeah, because I'm thinking too, like, so like none of these people that came into contact there, like they didn't have any connections of like coming down with cancers or
supposedly
illnesses.
Not.
Supposedly not. I didn't put this in my story, but Anna, Robert's wife, did ultimately end up with throat cancer, and she did blame standing at the end of the bed as part of that's what she thinks ultimately caused it.
Yeah.
But there was nothing that could tie it
You can't
specifically
prove it
back
one
to
way or
that.
the
and
other.
prove it.
She's the only one out of everybody who came in contact.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Unfun fact.
unfun fact.
Yeah. What about the United Nuclear Corporation? Surely they got forced to close down, right? Like
Of
after
course,
this
yeah.
event? Surely, right?
Doubt it.
Yeah. The Charleston facility did shut down for a brief decontamination after the accident, but by February 1965, remember it happened in July 1964, so just a couple months later, we're back in business. Nothing happened
Wait,
yet.
so
We're
it
ready to
happened
go.
it happened in January?
July of
Oh, July.
1964.
Okay. All
Yeah,
right.
and they reopened in February
Yeah.
65. The Atomic Energy Commission, also known as the AEC, the regulatory body at the time, had the lovely responsibility of regulating the industry, but they also had the job of promoting nuclear energy.
Yeah.
That seems a little, conflict of interest.
Yeah, I'm
maybe?
going to do both of those.
Yeah. Either way, the AEC investigated and found that the United Nuclear Corporation violated 14 separate safety regulations. So obviously, United Nuclear must have gotten hugely fined, right? 14 regulations?
Yeah.
Yeah. But no, not at all. They didn't get a single fine. No
What?
fines are issued or anything like that. Not one. Now, I want to be fair. The Atomic Energy Commission apparently could suspend and revoke licenses and issue warnings, but they didn't have the ability to fine. But even if that is true, I ask, where the fuck is the United States government? Where is the state of Rhode
Yeah,
Island
right?
putting fines on this, facility? United Nuclear Corporation never even admitted fault for the incident. Instead, they blamed Robert Peabody for the event, claiming he was aloof and frequently made mistakes. And if that is your case, why didn't you fire his ass if it was true, right?
Yeah, I mean, he's in a facility handling
Nuclear,
dangerous, toxic material.
Yeah.
It's okay if you keep fucking up. We're going to let you stay, but, you know, it's fine.
Yep. United Nuclear called the event human error rather than the result of their weak safety protocols, lack of oversight, and blatant negligence, in my opinion. And then they did something even more disgusting. Instead of acknowledging Robert Peabody as an employee of the facility, United Nuclear found a loophole. They labeled him a contaminated person instead, a twisted designation that allowed United Nuclear from having to pay full compensation and benefits to Anna Peabody and their 9 children.
Corporate America.
Let that settle in.
Wow.
Yeah. At the time, there were almost no legal protections for nuclear workers in the private industry. United Nuclear exploited that gap to the fullest, shielding itself from wrongful death lawsuits by arguing Peabody's exposure was unique and therefore not covered under normal workplace injury laws. It was, in my opinion, a complete betrayal on every fucking level.
Yeah.
That's awful.
So terrible. And if you hear me laughing, it's just because, like, what the fuck else do you do? Like, this is so fucking ridiculous, right? So I just want to say right now, get fucked, United Nuclear Corporation.
I will second that.
Yeah. And I support it.
A few years after the incident, United Nuclear Corporation did what any shame-ridden company would do. They rebranded. They officially became UNC, further distancing themselves from the accident. In 1980, just 1 year after 3 Mile Island disaster, the Charlestown facility shut down for good. Unfortunately, United Nuclear didn't die. In 1981, it was actually bought out by General Electric because, of course it was.
Sure.
Yeah.
That's what happens.
That's what happens. All right. Well, as we wrap up the story here, a couple more points I just want to share real quick. But what happened to the land, right? We entered this story saying that for 52 years, it was kind of gated off, right? So for those 52 years, the land where United Corporation facility once stood remained off limits to the public, a silent, fenced-off reminder of the deadly accident that unfolded there. In September 1995, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission officially declared the site safe, a full 30 years after the accident. But it wasn't until 2016 that the state of Rhode Island gave the final green light, ruling that no further action was necessary. The chain link fence that surrounded the site was finally removed, and just like that, it was open again to the public. Today, the land has been completely reclaimed by nature. It was purchased by Francis C. Carter Memorial Preserve, a sprawling conservation area that erases almost all traces of what once stood there. Trees, bushes, and wildlife have moved back in. If you were to visit it now, you'd probably never guess that the ground beneath your feet was once the site of one of the deadliest radiation accidents in U.S. history. And lastly, what about the community? Was there radiation contamination? Did anything happen to the community? According to government records, the radiation never spread beyond the footprint of the building itself. The local water table, the nearby river were all tested and no contamination was ever detected. Sounds reassuring, right?
What did the people of the town say?
Ooh, just
No, it doesn't sound reassuring.
I don't care what the government says. I want to know what the people in the surrounding towns have to say.
I was curious too, Kathy. Out of pure curiosity, I looked up the cancer rates for the county, Washington County. The numbers were slightly higher than average, but oddly enough, lower than several counties in New Hampshire where there were no criticality events. So it didn't really lead me into any real conclusion.
Yeah.
Doesn't seem like it stood out. So if there were lingering effects from the accident, they don't seem to show up in government or health data. However, here's where things get a little murky. There are multiple online threads from people who live in and around the area who swear that they or their loved ones suffered unexplained illnesses that they believe were caused by the facility. Their stories don't appear in government reports, but they persist in whispers, in local rumors, in the kind of antidotes that will never quite go away. And that is my research and my story on the Wood River Junction, Rhode Island criticality.
I'm kind of speechless. I never knew that happened.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that story. Thank you. You used a lot of really big words and sounded really, really smart. But beside that, it's so many questions. They shut down this entire area of the woods after they had returned to production? Like, what happened? Why all of a sudden did they change their minds? It seems like they're writing the rules and figuring it out as they go. And
what I seemed to uncover was that after the building was taken down, and they tested the grounds for radiation. Apparently, the only radioactive footprint they could find was directly under the building from right where, even though it happened on the 3rd floor from where the event occurred. So that's why they fenced off that particular area. Whether they could sense the radiation and still let workers work there, probably, if I had to guess.
I had no idea that this even happened.
Yeah.
And we got like family in Rhode Island. I just feel like, that's what happens when you have a company and a disaster. They want to cover it up, and the people that are supposed to be regulating it are also promoting it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it kind of makes sense that this just sort of got swept underneath the rug, and then other big world events happened. So
yeah.
And, this is what happens when we start playing around with technologies that we don't understand completely. It could have huge side effects.
Yeah, for sure. And I agree, Kathy, because I had never heard about this story. And I saw a YouTube video on it. And then I was like, that is like so, sorry, death isn't cool. But I thought the story was unique and strange and weird. And although it doesn't exactly maybe fit the vibe for the kind of stories we were telling, at the same time, I feel like it totally does. It's like a weird, unique incident that has really only happened in New England.
Yeah.
And
I think it totally fits our vibe.
Yeah.
I mean, we're not just one little box.
Yeah. You can't put Weirder After Dark in a box. That's right. I love that. I hope you two enjoyed the story, and gang, I hope you did too. So with that, we want to remind you that we will be going ahead and dropping some additional information, pictures, and context on our Instagram that you can visit at Weirder After Dark. Also know that we are building communities right now. So you can visit us both on Reddit as well as on Facebook at Weirder After Dark. And there you can interact with us or our communities. Be there. Find other people who are enjoying these episodes just like you. And if you are loving this shit and you are absolutely liking this shit, what we would love for you to do is to share an episode with somebody that you know who might also like it. And if you're absolutely fucking in love with this shit, then wherever you're listening to this podcast, drop us a quick like and comment on that podcast site and give us a 5-star review. It'd mean the world to us and will help us on our path forward. And lastly, we are always on the lookout for your stories. So if you've had anything strange, weird, paranormal, undescribable happen to you, feel free to send that story to us, and you can send that to thegang@weirderafterdark.com. And to wrap up our episode, just like every time, remember, it always gets a little weirder after dark.
Bye.
Thank you, guys.